Welcome back to our study of Leviticus. In this session, I'd like to do something a little bit different, and that is to review where we've been and to talk about some common objections, one in particular that is often raised against Christians in the way in which we read Leviticus. We've now been working through this text for quite a while, and we began by talking about how to approach this text wisely and well, hearing it as a word that is from God to his people throughout all time, including us, but through his people at a particular time, and that is Israel, as they were moving from slavery in Egypt to freedom in the Promised Land. And we talked for a couple sessions about what we find in the first 7 chapters of this book, these various offerings and sacrifices that God has given the people in order to draw near to this God, in order to draw near to him having drawn near to them. He has come down and intends to dwell among the people, and he has promised that his presence will take up residence in this tent of meeting, this tabernacle that they have created and constructed according to his design. And so these sacrifices talk about how people can be reconciled to God in spite of the fact that we are sin and unclean. There's this dual problem that they take care of. Then from there, we talked about how in chapters 8 through 10 of Leviticus, we are looking at the establishment of the priesthood and the arrival of God's presence, but then the fact that things go south really quickly. So there's a specific class of people, a specific family that's been called to serve as priests, a specific, family out of a specific tribe whose job is to oversee these things. And Aaron's sons Nadab and Abihu decided to take matters into their own hand, change the liturgy however they wanted, and as a result, they died. And so you have this wonderful moment of God coming down, combined with the fact that we better be very careful because God's presence is not only glorious, but it is dangerous. And so we need to know how to live with this God in our midst. That launched us into an exploration of chapters 11 through 15, which is where we learn about clean and unclean laws in all sorts of different ways: food, sex, bodily emissions, birth, skin diseases, all these different things. And really, we learned it's not really about like morality. It's not about godliness or ungodliness. It really is about ritual cleanness and wholeness. And these laws were designed to teach us how to live with God. In some cases, the point wasn't even the law itself, but rather the boundary that God wanted to create to teach the people to live within boundaries, those sorts of things. Then we looked at chapter 16, which is the Day of Atonement, the central day in the Jewish calendar, where you have the various rituals that communicate and affect the reconciliation of God with his people, sort of clean the entirety of the place and the people and the things so that they can be fit for God's presence to continue to dwell among them. We looked in 17 about some specific instructions for making sure that you worship well. And then over the last few chapters, really 18 through 22, which is as far as we've gotten, we just have seen a lot of different laws about all sorts of things: worship, sex, justice, personal relationships, political relationships, Sabbath keeping, all these various things. And what I want to do now is to acknowledge that there are some objections that often are raised against these texts and reading them as a word from God today and the way we read them today. I think there are some kind of obvious on the surface type objections that they just don't necessarily fly real well in our particular time and place. There's an emphasis on rituals. There are quite a few rules, and there's a very clear hierarchy. Rituals, rules, and hierarchy are hardly things that our culture thinks highly of. And yet really the main issue that I've noticed in terms of people objecting is the idea of picking and choosing. This is the question I so often either see online or hear from friends who may be skeptics or who may be thinking about the faith or just inside or just outside the faith. Why do we pick and choose? Even mature believers, why do we pick and choose some laws and not the others? And there's a general sense in which I think we feel this. Why would we, apply some of the laws about, respect for the parents and all the sexual regulations, but we don't care about eating shellfish or getting tattoos or whatever it may be? And in particular, I tend to hear these types of things, and maybe you do too, when it comes to questions of sexual ethics. Obviously, there's nobody's unaware of the fact that there's a rise in LGBTQ awareness and advocacy, and even within the church, a number of different groups, denominations, and persons are really wrestling with. So, why would we just affirm what the Old Testament, what Leviticus says about homosexuality, if we're not going to affirm what it says about other things? And it reminds me actually of a spoof letter that I one time received from a friend of mine. A friend of mine was, he was trying to follow Jesus, and his lifestyle had some things about it that a lot of Christians would have a problem with, and you could fill in the blanks. Good friend, honest friend. And I remember one time he sent me this email, and it was kind of a joke. He kind of wasn't saying this, but at the same time he was saying, well, what about this? And I want to read it to you. You maybe have seen it. It's been around forever. It says, "Dear Pastor, I wonder whether you can help me with the interpretation of some of the Old Testament laws. When people try to defend the homosexual lifestyle, I remind them that Leviticus 18:22 clearly states it to be an abomination. I know that God's word is eternal and unchanging, but I do need some advice from you about some other laws." And then there's a list of bullets. First one. "When I burn a bull on the altar as a sacrifice, I know it creates a pleasing odor for the Lord," Leviticus 1:9. "The problem is my neighbors. They claim the odor is not pleasing to them. How should I deal with this?" Bullet number 2. This was kind of rough. "I would like to sell my children into slavery, as suggested in Exodus 21:7. In this day and age, what do you think would be a fair price for my eldest? Could I sell my sons and my daughters, or just one or the other? I know that I am allowed," here's one, "I know that I am allowed no contact with a woman while she is in her period of menstrual uncleanness," Leviticus 15:19-24. "The problem is, how do I tell? I have tried asking, but most women take offense. I'll bet you do." Leviticus 25:44 states that I may buy slaves from the nations that are around us. A friend of mine claims that this applies to Canadians, but not Cubans. Can you clarify? I have a neighbor who insists on working on the Sabbath. Exodus 35:2 states he should be put to death. Am I morally obligated to kill him myself, or is there some gray area here? A friend of mine feels that even though eating shellfish is an abomination, Leviticus 10:10, it is a lesser abomination than homosexuality. I don't agree. Can you settle this? In all these matters, I admit some concern about the backlash on Twitter. I know Jesus tells us to expect hatred for testifying that the world is evil, so I probably shouldn't care, but managing my mentions has become overwhelming. Your help in these matters is greatly appreciated. I know that we, unlike many other so-called Christians, take Scripture seriously and seek to live it out even when doing so is unpopular and uncomfortable. Sincerely, Concerned Christian. Now, that letter is a spoof, and he was just sort of offering it tongue-in-cheek, but at the same time, it does represent a certain real objection. And let's take this seriously. I don't want to straw man this and just say everybody who feels this isn't thinking clearly or is trying to get away with something. Well, not necessarily. I think that this is a proper thing for us to acknowledge and for us to offer a thought-out answer. Why is it that we seemingly pick and choose? Why is it that we take some of these commands and say, oh, those are for all time, and others of these commands and say, no, those no longer apply to us? And so what I'd like to talk through with you are, I'd like to talk about some categories that we can think through for understanding the different types of laws. I'd like to talk about some principles that we can apply when it comes to living these things out, and then we'll look at some case studies. So first of all, let's look at some categories. If you have studied these things before, perhaps you've seen the older breakdown between moral, civil, and ceremonial laws. I will confess to you that I do not find that breakdown helpful. I don't think it makes sense of the text and their ancient context, and I don't think it necessarily maps super cleanly in terms of which one continue to apply today. I do think, though, that we can think about some of the categories that naturally emerge from the text. And some of these words are maybe weird, but I think you'll know what I mean by them. One of the things I want us to notice is that some of the laws are polemic. And if that's not a word you're familiar with, it just means that they are against something. The whole point of the law is that it is against the practices of the people around them. We have seen this in the last sessions. There are specific places, and I'll put some scripture references for you to follow up in the handout so that you can follow along. There's some specific places where the law clearly is designed to push against the practices of the community around them. So you're holy because God is holy. Israel's called to be holy because God is different. And so a lot of these laws are because they do it this way, and we don't want you to do it like them because they're worshiping other gods. We're going to have you not do it that way. And there's another set of laws that are not so much polemic against other peoples, but they're more like pedagogical or instructional. The idea is that, oops, I forgot the A in there. Pedagogical, there you go. The idea is that God is instructing his people over time, and he's giving them a law right now that really the point of the law isn't even the law itself is so important, but it's more so it's designed to teach you a deeper lesson. So as you follow the boundaries, you become capable. Remember, wax on, wax off. You learn this thing even though you don't really realize all of what you're learning. Here, probably the clearest example is laws having to do with like not mixing two kinds of things. So don't mix two kinds of animals or don't mix two kinds of fabrics. Why not? Like, what's the big deal with like a cotton polyester blend? Well, the issue is it wasn't ever about shirts. It was about Israel recognizing that they really are called to be different and that they're not going to be able to love the outsiders among them until they recognize that they worship a different God, and so they're called to be different. And so not mixing the cloths was really a discipline to understand that they are not to mix in inappropriate ways with the peoples around them. So you have these laws that are polemic, and then you have these laws that are pedagogical, and then you have these other laws that really are, we'll call them transcultural. So they're not specifically for one culture. They're not specifically for one time and place. They may take shape in one time and place, but the idea of honoring your father and mother, or of not bearing false testimony. There are some laws that transcend time and space. Now, one of the things to notice about these two is that they're temporary. The laws that are polemic and the laws that are pedagogical are temporary. And right there, that's where it feels like the objection. Why in the world would you say that God's people were supposed to follow some laws, but then you get to a certain point and they're not supposed to follow those laws anymore? Because it is what we say. I mean, that's what Jesus and the apostles taught, that under the old covenant, the people were to follow the food laws, for instance. But then you get to the new covenant and the food laws no longer apply. Under the old covenant, the people were to follow the Sabbath laws. But then you get to the new covenant and the Sabbath laws no longer literally apply. Why? Why is that okay? Isn't that a contradiction? And I don't think it's a contradiction. If you recognize that we're talking about an unfolding plan, if you recognize that this is, if you think about it in terms of like a narrative historical flow, that God is working with his people over time, then it's actually kind of sensible that you would have certain laws for certain moments, but then not for others. Think of an example. Let's say my wife and my son are going to get ice cream. And in our particular town, there's an ice cream shop on I think it's 9th Street, down on Main Street, Main and 9th. So let's say they're walking down Main Street, they park at 5th, and they're going to walk down to 9th. And at a certain point, Beth says to Carson, stop, don't go across the street. And then about, 45 seconds later, she says, okay, go across the street. Now, if you were to look at a transcript on paper of those things, that would look like they flat contradict each other. You can't get any more contradictory than stop, don't cross the street, and go across the street. But you would not say she's contradicting each other because you recognize what's going on. The light in front of them turned red, and so she said, stop. And then the light turned green, and so she said, go. There are other rules that she might have for him that involve something that is transcultural. Keep your eyes open, pay attention to what's going on around you. That's not just something that you do when the light is red or the light is green. So some things you do when the light is red, other things you do when the light is green, and still other things you do all the time. And in that sense, you can see how just because we say that certain laws were polemic and pedagogical for a time, but not for our time, it's not a contradictory. It's a recognition that we've entered a different phase in the story. Romans 10:4 says that Christ is the end, the telos, the culmination, the goal of the law. And now that Christ has come, I'm thinking also about Galatians chapter 3. Now that Christ has come, the law is no longer serving the purpose that it did. It has served its purpose of getting us to Jesus. And now Jesus, through the Spirit, says, I will take it from here. And so you've got these different categories that we need to learn to think through when it comes to whether a particular law in the Old Testament applies. But that doesn't necessarily tell us how to do it. And so what I also want to provide for you are, we'll call them principles. And really, I think there's two, and I don't even know how to number them because it's not so much that one is first and the other is second, but they really work together. We'll go ahead and number them 1 and 2, just because I'm going to put in the first category the one that actually is most important, even though I'm going to encourage you to think about the second category first, even as you go back and forth. We'll put them shorthand here. The first principle is, what does the New Testament say? So you want to check apostolic teaching. The apostolic teaching that we have in the New Testament, the teaching of the apostles that Christ sent out and that the Spirit inspired to clarify God's full revelation and will for us, actually is our primary check. If a law is affirmed in the New Testament as being for all time, then it is for all time. If a law is rejected in the New Testament as being only for a time, then it is only for a time. So that's really the easiest place to go. Most of the examples I've tried to bring, I think, are examples that the New Testament is fairly clear about. The other thing that I want to say, though, is, I want you to think it through. At the end of the day, I think when it comes to looking at Leviticus, even apart from seeing that the New Testament confirms or denies some of these things, confirms in the sense of it's transcultural, still applies, or no, it was temporary, no longer applies. Even though the New Testament is a wonderful gift that helps us really solidify these things, we've actually been able to discern some of these categories simply by paying close attention to Leviticus. And so if you would think things through and try to discern, well, what's going on here? Is there a deeper principle that seems like it would manifest itself in the same practice now, or is something else in play? And then you check that against the New Testament, see what the New Testament says, and then come back to Leviticus. I think you'll be well on your way. I don't want to make it seem like it's so obvious and clear, because there are some examples where it's not entirely clear how it should be read in the ancient context, and maybe the New Testament doesn't say anything about it. And in those particular cases, I think we need to hold our opinions a little bit more loosely as we think and discern together in terms of how to do this. So those are the categories and principles. Let's now look at a few different case studies to see if we can kind of see some of this in practice. One of the more important, I don't know if it's most important, but one of the naturally important examples that we need to take a look at, because it is such an important issue for many people who we love and want to care for well as Christians and as leaders today, is the question of homoerotic sexuality or homosexuality. You see it mentioned a couple of times in chapter 18:20 and 18:22. And in chapter 20:13, these laws specifically against male-to-male sexual intercourse. And I think they would have understood it to cover female-to-female, although that wasn't as common at the particular time. The idea here is, what have we already seen? Remember, we looked at this in a session on sexual ethics, and one of the things we saw of Leviticus 18 is that it's not just a bunch of random lists, but it actually seems to be drawing from Genesis 1 and 2. And the idea that sex is for marriage, and marriage is between two people who are similar but different, because it has this function of, concretely procreation, but more deeply of manifesting God's love, which is covenantal. So it's just one-to-one. You can't just have sex with everybody, but it's also differentiated. God loves that which is similar but different, his people on earth, in a way that increases joy and produces new life. And so this framework emerged from reading the rules of Leviticus 18 in light of the bigger picture of Genesis chapter 1 and 2. We also find something very similar when we check it against the New Testament teaching. One of the things that is, I think, really important in this regard is to recognize the language of those two passages. So you know that the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, and then Paul would have probably had access to the Hebrew Old Testament. I think he did. But he primarily used a Greek version of the Old Testament called the Septuagint. So think about it in this sense. So you have the Hebrew text, which was the original, and then it's translated into the Septuagint. That's the abbreviation for the Septuagint, for some reasons we can maybe talk about another time. And then you have Paul. So Paul, in a few different places, Romans chapter 1, 1 Corinthians 6, 1 Timothy 1, talks about what a word that's often translated homosexuality. Arsenokoitai is the word. And what's interesting is, no one ever used that word until Paul. And so it's quite likely that he actually invented the word. So far as we know, I think Paul invented two words. One is the word tapaino phrosune, which is the word translated humility. It means to think of yourself properly lowly, to put others above yourself. And arsenokoitai, the word that's translated homoerotic sexuality or homosexuality. I think it's fascinating to think about those two words as the two Paul created. Anyway, in this regard, Paul actually is creating a word that uses the Greek translation of the Hebrew in Leviticus chapter 18:22 and 20:13. So it's almost certain that Paul is actually affirming this particular part of the Levitical teaching, that he is describing as a vice, as one of the ways that sin tries to get its grip on us, a homoerotic sexual lifestyle, when two persons of the same sex are engaged in sexual intercourse in a sexual relationship. So in looking at Leviticus, I think that the scale was slanted toward taking this as not just a cultural thing, but a transcultural thing. And you find that confirmed not only when you look at what the New Testament says about these things, but also the specific words that are used in this regard. There are, of course, other but what abouts. But what about the fact that they didn't know sex in the same way we do? I think a lot of those arguments are honestly overblown. The ancient world was very familiar with very positive expressions of homoerotic sexuality. And so it's just not historically accurate to say they didn't know of homosexual love between persons. And one might say, well, what about sexual orientation? And again, these are a lot of issues that deserve and really require patient reflection. I think a biblical answer to that is to recognize that the Bible is actually not so much concerned with how settled are our pattern of desires, but whether our desires are in keeping with God's creation, with God's design for us. That's what it's always going to come back to when it comes to this issue, is that God designed this for a particular reason, and therefore you have these particular boundaries and guidelines. I don't want to just pick on that one issue because my interest is not in that particular issue. It's a really important question that we need to think through very patiently and lovingly, and I think that this helps us do it well. But I also want to very briefly look at another section or two in thinking about the different principles we've talked about. I already talked about some of the laws from chapter 19, So look at 19:19, says, keep my decrees. Do not make different kinds of animals. Do not plant your field with two kinds of seed. Do not wear clothing woven of two kinds of material. Well, I think that we could kind of draw from Leviticus that this seems like the whole issue of not mixing things so Israel recognizes they're holy. And then when you come to the New Testament, you don't have any mention of these things. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean, hey, it's all good, it's not in there. But it does mean that we should be very careful thinking that it's still a law that applies today. And what you do see in the New Testament is that there is still a call to holiness, but it is very much not about Israelites separating from the Gentiles. As a matter of fact, we've reached the point now where Gentiles are included in the family. And the call to holiness now manifests itself in moral categories like forgiveness and self-control and patience and the way we treat one another. And so we should read these as encouragements from God for us to identify those parts of life that are out of bounds for us and then to stay away from them. We have no part with unforgiveness. We have no part with an attitude of vengeance. We have no part with a narcissistic selfishness. So that's how we would read those texts. You keep going down, you've got another, some sort of weird ones. I don't want to avoid the weird ones. He says in 19, don't eat meat with blood still in it. Acts 15 asks the Gentiles at the time to abstain from eating meat with blood because the Jewish synagogues were all throughout the land. And so this was a law that, it was a law that the Jews followed, but it was a law that at that time in the early church, the Gentiles were asked to follow, not because it was a principle of obedience, but as a matter of unity with the Jews at the time who were still getting used to the fact that Gentiles were included. Next one says, don't cut the hair at the sides of your head or clips off the edges of your beards. Oh, I skipped it. Don't practice divination or seek omens. Then the cutting the hair, clipping the beard. Don't cut your bodies for the dead or put tattoo marks on yourselves. Here, most likely what we're looking at is sacred, funeral rituals that would be present among the pagans in the land, that these are the ways in which they would mourn for their dead. And so the issue is not just you can't get a tattoo or you can't trim your sideburns. The issue is, no, I don't want you mourning in the ways that they're mourning. They're cutting themselves and marking themselves and doing weird things to try to sort of connect with the dead and make sure that the dead are okay. No, I want you to have none of that. And so here we recognize that these would fall into the polemic category. And therefore, we would be inclined to read them as temporary laws, wanting to check against the New Testament. So I think the idea is fairly clear in terms of what we should be doing as believers. So the accusation that is often cast upon us is that we pick and choose. And you will find some Christian teachers who will say, sure, we pick and choose. Well, I just want to pick and choose wisely. I suppose that's fair enough. But I would prefer, instead of thinking in terms of picking and choosing, that we think in terms of discerning and doing. So what I'm encouraging us to move from is away from picking and choosing. I'm just going to take the ones I want and leave the rest, and more toward discerning and doing. That we're going to try to apply our minds with the wisdom that God has given us in the whole of Scripture, thinking through what these specific commands reveal to us about the principles of holiness and the holy God behind them, and then putting into practice what we discern as being God's will. I can't not think of Romans chapter 12:2, which talks about how we are transformed by the renewal of our mind as we offer our bodies as a living sacrifice so that we are able to discern what is God's will, the good, the pleasing, and the perfect. And so once more, let's move from pick and choose to discern and do. And may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. May the Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace.